Okay, let's be honest. Have you ever taken one of those silly online quizzes that tells you what kind of sandwich you are? Yeah, me too. Turns out I'm a classic BLT. Not exactly sure what that says about me, but it did get me thinking. What's the real science behind trying to measure the human mind? Today, we're going to dive into that world, the fascinating world of psychological testing, and separate the fun stuff from the serious science.
I mean, seriously, who hasn't? You click a few buttons about your favorite color, your spirit animal, and bam, you're sourdough. It's a fun way to kill 5 minutes for sure, but it kind of begs the question, right? Is there any actual science to this?
And this is where we draw a line in the sand. On one side, you've got the fun quiz, totally built for entertainment. The results are all over the place. But on the other side, you've got actual psychological tests, and these are scientific tools built with an incredible amount of rigor. The difference is absolutely massive, and it really boils down to a couple of super important non-negotiable rules.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to cover the rules that make a test legit. Then, we'll take a quick tour of the major types of tests out there. And finally, we'll look at how these tools have actually shaped our world for, over 100 years. It's going to be interesting. All right, let's get into the real heart of it. For any psychological test to be taken seriously, to be considered a real scientific tool, it has to prove two things. And these aren't just suggestions. They are the absolute bedrock of this entire field. The first rule is reliability. It's really just a fancy word for consistency. Here's an easy way to think about it. Your bathroom scale. If you step on it and it says 150 pounds, and then you step off and get back on 2 minutes later and it says 150 pounds again, well, that scale is reliable. A psychological test has to work the same way. If a test says you're an extrovert today, a reliable test should give you a pretty similar score next week. Simple as that. It has to be consistent.
The second rule is validity, and this one's all about accuracy. This is so crucial. A valid test has to measure what it claims it's measuring. Let's go back to that scale. It could be super reliable, showing you 150 pounds every single time. But what if it's actually measuring your height? Well, then it's not valid, is it? A test that's supposed to measure anxiety shouldn't actually be measuring how well you can read. It sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. Making sure a test is truly valid is one of the hardest things to do.
And this quote just perfectly captures a really subtle point about validity. The psychologist Hans Eysenck is basically saying, look, the question itself doesn't have to make sense on the surface. You could ask if the moon is made of green cheese. As long as you can prove with data that one group of people consistently answers it one way and another group answers it a different way, then that weird question can actually be a valid way to tell those two groups apart. The bottom line for validity is, does it work?
So now that we've got the ground rules down, reliability and validity, let's see how they actually get used. We're going to do a quick tour of the major kinds of psychological tests, and each one is designed to map a totally different part of who we are.
Okay, first up, the big one, intelligence tests. You've definitely heard of these. They're built to measure a whole range of cognitive skills. Stuff like reasoning, problem solving, and how quickly you can think. The famous ones, like the YS, aren't just about book smarts. They're trying to get a bigger picture of your overall mental horsepower, your ability to adapt and handle complex problems.
Next up, we have personality tests. These are all about mapping your typical traits and behaviors, and they usually fall into two main camps. You have objective tests, like the MMPI, which is a long list of true or false questions that build a detailed profile. Then you have the projective tests, like the famous Rorschach ink blot test. The whole idea there is pretty cool. By telling someone what you see in a random ink blot, you're supposedly projecting your own unconscious thoughts and feelings onto it. Pretty wild stuff.
And finally, there are aptitude and interest tests. These are less about who you are right now and more about your potential for the future. An aptitude test might show you have a knack for spatial reasoning, which could mean you'd be a great engineer. An interest inventory, on the other hand, compares your likes and dislikes to people who are really happy in their jobs, helping point you toward a career you might actually love.
Okay, so for our last section, let's zoom out a bit. Because these tools, they didn't just stay in a psychology lab. Not at all. They went out into the real world and had a huge, tangible impact on everything from schools to the military to who gets hired for a job.
Now, what's really wild about this timeline is just how fast everything happened. Look at this. In 1905, we start with a simple test to help struggling kids in Paris. Just 12 years later, boom, 1917, the U.S. Army is using tests to screen nearly 2 million recruits for World War I. Then you see the evolution get more and more sophisticated with Wechsler's adult test and the MMPI for clinical diagnosis. The whole idea of testing just exploded. And when I say it exploded, I mean it. Get this, by the early 1960s, it's estimated that over 200 million intelligence tests were given out every single year in the US alone. 200 million. From schools putting kids on different tracks to companies deciding who to hire, testing became this massive society-shaping force.
So there you have it. We went all the way from sourdough bread quizzes to the serious scientific rules of reliability and validity, the very rules that support tools used to make huge, life-changing decisions. At the end of the day, these tests are really just our best attempt to understand ourselves. Which kind of leaves us with one last question for you. If you had a perfectly reliable and valid tool to measure just one thing about your own mind, what would you most want it to reveal?